Hi friends, welcome back to the Holistic Health Podcast. We are talking about SIBO myths because SIBO, which is short for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, is one of the most common reasons that we see in clinic for digestive issues like bloating, gas, constipation, loose stools, and is also one of the most common causes of IBS that we see in clinic. And it is something that we have done podcast episodes on before, and also it was one of our most popular episodes, and there still seems to be a few myths or misconceptions that come up a lot actually in both in clinic with clients and also sometimes just I've noticed a few different things being shared online that I'm like, oh, it's not quite accurate to say. So we thought we'd go through some of the ones that we most commonly come across and just give our 2 cents on what we think about them. So the first one is actually the myth that, I guess it's a bit of a double myth. There's some people who say SIBO testing is the be all and end all, as in you have to do it, it's 100% accurate, and that's how you know if you have SIBO or not. And then in contrast, there are other people who are in the camp of, and some gastroenterologists fall into this camp, is that no point testing SIBO, really useless test, not accurate enough to show a meaningful result. And I would say I sit somewhere in between is what I think, because it's true that SIBO breath testing is not a foolproof test, as in there is room for error in terms of getting false positives, as in coming up that you have SIBO when you don't have SIBO. And also there is different degrees of accuracy with it across the board. And I think that's really important to know as both a client and also as a practitioner. But I also think that just because the test is imperfect doesn't mean that it's useless. It just means that you use it when you feel like you need to, and you aim to do the test in a context that is as accurate as possible. And part of that is just adequately preparing for the test, and that's going to slightly differ depending on which SIBO test you're doing. So following the instructions is important. And then also matching your symptoms up with the test results rather than having all these symptoms and then a test coming back as negative. If everything's still pointing towards it and you have other evidence, I'd still be following the thread to a degree. And then the flip side is also true in that it's, well, maybe not exactly in that way, but what I'm trying to say is like matching up symptoms and testing is really important, and that it's nuanced in terms of how accurate either of them are. There are situations in my clinic, I don't know about you, Ames, where financially people aren't in a position to be able to do SIBO testing on top of the other testing that is a priority, and so I will treat them based on quite a clear clinical picture, and I'll do it in a way that is conservative but still going to make a difference and gives us a bit of an idea based on their response or lack thereof whether or not we're on the right track. And that might sound a little bit less than perfect, but you'll find when you're in the real world situation, as many of you are, and you've only got X amount of money to invest in your health, it's my belief that we don't want to spend all our money and our resources on testing if we can pick it up through other ways. And one other way is through very clear symptom patterning and short-term trials of things, because if you spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars doing every test under the sun, you're going to get to a point when it comes to then treating what's found and have no resources to spend towards that. So that's my approach, is I sit somewhere in between there. And so that's probably my first point.
I'm with you on that too. Sometimes it's so blatantly obvious that someone has SIBO, and it's like, yes, we could do this test, but that's almost $300. to sort of tell me this is the direction we need to go in, which you could put towards treatment for the next couple of months. And even if someone had unlimited resources, it can sometimes feel like a bit of a waste. But if you need clarity and you can swing it, sure, that's a really good option. So I agree with you. It is a real balancing act. There's kind of like what you do by the textbook, and then what you do in reality in clinic. Sometimes you've just got to adjust according to what your clients need. But by the same token, when it comes to dysbiosis in the gut, there are many different types, and I think because the term SIBO has gotten really well known and popular, I think everyone thinks all bloating and gut problems are SIBO. And they're not necessarily. There's all kinds of dysbiosis you can get. And SIBO literally stands for small intestinal bowel overgrowth. But it's a bacterial overgrowth, sorry.
Your bowel's not growing too much.
Yeah, no, your bowels. Are you sure? You haven't seen my colon? No,
I haven't.
Bacterial overgrowth, thank you. But it's a very specific class of bacteria. So it's not necessarily, you can have other types of bacterial overgrowth that aren't SIBO. And then within the SIBO umbrella, there are multiple different types of SIBO as well. And that can absolutely add nuance to how treatment plans are put together and what's going to be most effective. And usually what we see with SIBO is there's a trajectory of the way that it starts. It tends to be dominant in one particular type of bacteria and gas, and then over time another bacteria that feeds off that gas then becomes more dominant, and depending on where you're at can really help guide an appropriate treatment plan. Of course, there can also be bacterial overgrowth in the large intestine, sometimes called LIBO, and we can also see fungal overgrowth in the small intestine, which is called SIFO. So it's a bit of a hodgepodge.
It is.
Well, it's a really technical term, isn't it? What's going down there. So it's not like, oh, I'm going to buy this supplement for SIBO, or I'm going to follow, this protocol for SIBO. It's like, well, what type have you actually got? I mean, I'm sure everything helps a bit, but the trouble is, a bit like with antibiotic resistance to infections, I've noticed people can really create problems for themselves by taking SIBO supplements and self-medicating and end up creating more resistant bacteria, which then just takes much longer to clear, which can be really frustrating for patient and practitioner.
Yeah. And sometimes I think people get confused when practitioners say, like, for example, you've done a stool test, like a gut test, and maybe you've been told, oh yeah, you have SIBO. Sometimes what's missing in the explanation of that is that, technically speaking, when a practitioner is saying that, it's half accurate, as in they're accurate in their mind, but sometimes I find when they've communicated that to someone and someone walks away being like, because I get a lot of people who come to me from other practitioners and they'll be like, yeah, I've done a gut test and a stool test and I found I have SIBO. A stool test is a reflection of what's happening primarily in the large intestine, but we can infer from what's happening there to what's happening in the small intestine. So as an example of that, there are certain species of bacteria that can be overgrown in a large intestine that will come up on a microbiome mapping test or a gut stool test that indicate to us as a practitioner that there is an overgrowth, like a LIBO, so a large intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and it may hint, if symptoms also hint at this, that same overgrowth that is there in that large intestine and being picked up on that gut test is in the small intestine. But technically, like, they're kind of two different locations, but they influence each other. So that's just to explain it a little bit further in case people are confused about, oh, but I got a gut test. And so I'd say the presence of a bacterial overgrowth in a gut test is very likely, if symptoms match up, that is also being reflected or happening in the small intestine as well. But a lack of presence of a bacterial overgrowth in the large intestine on a stool test doesn't automatically mean that there's nothing going on in the small intestine if symptoms are indicating it in that way. So that's just something to be aware of if you're going down the path of testing and trying to understand that. So the other thing I would say that I see commonly be a bit of a myth is that all SIBO requires treatment with a low FODMAP diet. Half true, maybe 2/3 true. So in my experience and from what I've learnt through some of my mentors in this space is that if someone has methane and hydrogen overgrowth, which are the most, I would say in my clinical experience, the most common types of SIBO and LIBO, it often does respond well to a low FODMAP diet. And that's what a lot of people with IBS get put on. And when they notice a difference in their symptoms in terms of a positive difference, that can be a hint amongst others that perhaps they do have a bacterial overgrowth. And that's why there's been a small improvement in symptoms. But often it doesn't resolve it because the overgrowth is still there. It's just not being fed. But if there are other types of overgrowth, like a hydrogen sulfur overgrowth or sulfur producing bacteria, sometimes those respond better to something that is just a low sulfur diet as opposed to something that is a low FODMAP diet. And actually in some instances, having someone on a low FODMAP diet can worsen that situation. We might do a separate episode on that in its entirety in terms of, because I feel like it's a different way of thinking and treating it as opposed to the more common one that we're talking about today that comes up with SIBO. But that's just something to be aware of is that, and also there are quote unquote SIBO diets and they're very similar, I would say, to low FODMAP diet. Like as an example, I created my own version of it that I give to my clients that I would say is a bit of a hybrid of the traditional low FODMAP diet and the SIBO diet that was created by Jacoby, who is one of the naturopathic practitioners that has done a lot of educational work in this space of SIBO. So I did that based on what I saw made the biggest difference for clients because I also think that it is a bit of a bonus myth that you have to be 100% perfect with the diet in order to get a result. I think if diet is your only tool, maybe that is true. But if you're also using antimicrobial herbs, nutrients, nervous system work, I would say that as long as you're 80 to 90% following the thing that is most supportive for you with the diet, that extra little percent is not really going to make or break you.
No, I find people with SIBO just are so aware of what triggers their symptoms and they so want to be symptom free that they generally are very compliant. But that being said, I think another myth is that a SIBO diet is all you need to do to clear it, and you actually can't outstarve a bacterial overgrowth. What you're doing is reducing dramatically their food source whilst you kill them off to kind of enhance things and also get symptomatic relief. But yeah, I think just following a SIBO diet is definitely not enough. And also following, you've got to be very specific about which one you're following, because a lot of people think that a low FODMAP diet is a SIBO diet, and it's not. Like there are other types of carbohydrates that also fuel those classes of bacteria. I think Alison Siebeck is a combo of low FODMAP and specific carbohydrate diet, but my favorite is also Narala's biphasic diet, because I think you get those first couple of weeks where you get instant symptom relief and you get like you quantum leap in terms of antimicrobials, and then you can bring back a lot of things which make it just much easier to follow for the months that it usually takes to clear something like this. So yeah, there's a lot of noise out there, that's for sure. And another thing that I find people assume is that pharmaceutical medication to treat SIBO is more effective than herbal medicine and naturopathic medicine, and that sadly isn't the case, because if it was, we'd probably all just tell people to go and get the antibiotics. But they can be really hit and miss, unfortunately. And I don't know about you, Nat, but the approach that I take is, I mean, often when people have come to me, they've already tried a few things, they maybe have had antibiotics, and then it will, it might come back. And you're going to talk about why it can often come back, the other things that need to be addressed. But once I sort of get to that stage, I'll often try and take a combination approach, or, as is common with clients in our space, they don't want to take antibiotics. They just want to go the natural route. I've had another client who's like, I just want to take the antibiotics and get rid of it quickly. And I'm like, sure, we can do that, but that actually also might not guarantee the result. So let's try and do a combo, because that'll shorten the treatment trajectory for you anyway. Definitely in some cases, many cases, a pharmaceutical medication is going to be heavier hitting than a herbal medicine. But when it comes to SIBO, they are really stubborn. I call them, this class of bacteria, like the cockroaches of the immune system. They just
Why?
And I know, well, because an atomic bomb could go off and destroy the entire earth and the cockroaches will live, because they're just like indestructible. So
I don't want to know that.
I know. But it's the same for those bacteria. They are really, really, really robust. They are actually part of our natural microbiome. It's just that they overgrow when the terrain shifts, and dealing with the terrain is actually another major part of clearing it and making sure it doesn't come back. But anyway, on that note,
Next myth is definitely that once you kill the bacteria off, everything's just going to be fine and dandy, and
we wish
can brush off brush off your hands.
Yeah, wash your hands a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah. I was like, brush my shoulder,
brush
wash
the
my
brush the dirt off your shoulder.
You know what? You're picking up what I'm putting down. And that is unfortunately not true. So what we need to address, amongst many things, is yes, the terrain, so the rest of your gut microbiome, so that it helps you to prevent that bacterial overgrowth from coming back. But also we need to address supporting, probably ongoingly to a degree, what's called the migrating motor complex, which is kind of like this little system, so to speak, that exists in your small intestine that does these sweeps to sweep out bacteria and other things from your digestive system in order to help prevent SIBO or bacterial from overgrowing. And there are many things that you can do in order to support that MMC. So, like, one of them is simple as leaving adequate space between times when you eat food. So 3 hours is what I say as a minimum for it to go through a couple of good cleansing turns. So that's one thing, but also you can do other things that are supportive of the MMC in terms of like ginger as like a really simple thing, or there are other nutrients that you can use as well. And I also think it's really important to address the nervous system and the vagus nerve and vagal tone. And I see this as being one of the biggest reasons why people both get recurrence or have a really tough time getting rid of it, is that it's often the people where they're in a chronically stressed state, or they have poor vagal tone, or they are just, they haven't done any of that nervous system component to the gut work that makes a massive difference. So that's, probably a conversation for another day. But I think if nothing else, one thing that's really simple that people can do is make sure that they're not grazing on food all day, because at least not chronically, like nothing's going to happen to you if you graze on food for a couple of days here and there. But in terms of if your constant habit is having something to eat, even if it's only really teeny tiny, every hour or every 2 hours, outside of a season of life that might just be a necessity for. So I'm thinking of our mums that are in trimester 1 trying to survive, or who are breastfeeding and just trying to stay, get in food when they can. please just do not worry about this right now. But in terms of outside of that context, it's a good idea not to be a chronic grazer and to more have defined meals and adequate rest in between them.
I definitely try and do that. Although I've noticed, it's funny you say that because I've been super stressed, which makes it really hard for me to eat. And so it's taking me hours to like complete my breakfast, and then it's lunchtime, and then, oh my gosh, it's been dragging out. And all I could think about was my MMC. I'm like, no one's coming in to clean the building. Like I'm too busy stuffing food in. But yes, as you say, a few days here and there aren't going to ruin everything. But as a general rule, solid meals with good gaps in between is good for your gut health. And the last myth we want to touch on today is, and this is probably less common, but we know that there are humans out there that think, oh no, I'm going to have to be on a SIBO diet forever to control these symptoms or keep these bacteria at bay. The good news is absolutely not. Like once treatment has been completed and your microbiome has been restored and you've dealt with the terrain, whether that's the local microbiome or, you know, your sleep and stress habits and all of the things that set you up to develop SIBO in the first place, you should be able to eat whatever you want and not have symptoms. But there is a pathway between here and there that you need to follow. So what you don't want to do is go from a SIBO diet back to regular programming overnight. Partly because a dramatic change in your diet of any description is going to cause microbial whiplash in your gut. So let's, for example, you know, if you listen to our fiber episode recently, you can't go from a low fiber diet immediately to a high fiber diet because it looks good on paper. You will cause yourself some problems. The microbiome, the digestive system actually needs time to adjust when making significant changes. And in the case of a SIBO diet, you have removed so many different types of starches and fibers that were, you know, feeding those microbes that you were trying to get rid of. And so even if you've successfully eradicated the overgrowth, you want to introduce it slowly just so that your gut can adjust and upregulate the enzymes and the microbes that are going to actually metabolize those foods properly. But second of all, it's also a little bit of a test to ensure that eradication is complete, short of doing another test, for example, because if you start to react sort of halfway through that reintroduction process, you might need a little bit more treatment time before you can actually go back to a regular diet. But rest assured, the SIBO diet is really only for while you're on treatment, and the strictest version of that is really just in those first few weeks to just help you make some headway and get symptom free. So certainly I have a bit of a roadmap for clients where I introduce like the least likely to be problematic foods and then kind of reverse engineer them back to a regular diet from there. And that's graduated over, you know, several days, several types of doses before we move on to the next food. So working with a practitioner to do that, but please know it's not forever because it is, especially the initial one is quite restrictive and that can cause a little bit of panic. But for anyone who's listened to this who suspects they have SIBO or knows they do, we have got that other episode that Nat mentioned. We talk about our 6 steps to eradicating SIBO, and it really outlines the framework that we use with our clients. So if you're curious to know about that, if you want to identify any gaps in what you're currently doing, that could be a really good listen for you. And of course, if you are struggling with this, you are welcome to reach out to either one of us for some support.
I love it. Yeah, I think it's a really important thing to address because unfortunately, the longer you don't address it, the more significant it grows, and it is something that is fixable, is treatable with the right approach. So yeah, wholeheartedly agree with everything you said there. And if you have a friend who is the gassy friend or
the one that looks pregnant after every meal,
like the one that's complaining that they have a sore tummy all of the time, maybe send them this episode with love, or the other one, so that they can feel more comfy, or you can. So we will be with you again next week.
See you, friends.